The sun had sunk low behind jagged cliffs, spilling orange light over a landscape that had forgotten green. The rider's tires bit into cracked asphalt, flames licking the rims of his motorcycle. The engine spat sparks that hissed into the dry air, mingling with the faint stench of charred rubber curling up from scorched skid marks. Each breath carried the metallic tang of radiation. The taste clung to his tongue, acrid and bitter. He leaned into a curve, gravel crunching beneath the tires, feeling the vibration of the frame in his knuckles. A distant howl, some mutant scavenger maybe, echoed off the skeletal buildings lining the highway. He inhaled, catching a hint of fear buried in the dust, a scent layered beneath sweat and smoke. The wind carried it straight to him, and his chest tightened. A rusted car half buried in sand wobbled at the side of the road. He slowed, boots dragging over asphalt, metal scraping. The driver's skull burned hotter than the fading sun, the flames of his head reflected in the warped chrome of the vehicle. Something stirred inside, not the usual hunger for destruction, something sharp, precise, calculated. A presence. From the horizon, a dust plume rose, trailing across the cracked earth. Raiders. Their bikes were small, jagged, cobbled together from scraps and rust. They moved erratically, impatient, screeching tires kicking up pebbles. The acrid tang of gasoline burned in the air, but beneath it, the rider detected another layer. Arrogance, fear, and the faint coppery scent of blood already spilled. He shifted his weight, chains rattling against the bike's frame. Fingers curled around the handlebars, knuckles white, the heat from his skull spilling down his spine into the leather of his gloves. The raider's first shots cracked against the asphalt, ricocheting sparks that hissed as they landed. Metal fragments pinged off his bike. He didn't flinch. Not yet. The rider exhaled, feeling the air thick with dust, sand, and the lingering smoke of distant fires. He twisted the throttle, the engine growling in harmony with his skull flames. The first raider lunged, leaning too far into a curve, metal scraping asphalt, chains uncoiled like serpents, glowing faintly at the edges and whipped across the air. Sparks erupted as they connected with the raider's engine. The bike wobbled under sudden recoil. The scent of burning oil filled his nostrils. Behind him, a second raider veered in, tires biting into gravel, teeth gritted beneath a rusted helmet. The rider leaned forward, the weight of his body pressing into the flames of the bike's frame. He could feel every imperfection in the asphalt beneath him. Tiny fractures, crumbling edges, grit biting his boots. Chains snapped again, slicing a trail through the air, and the raider's bike shuddered and skidded into the dust, leaving a thin line of smoke curling into the horizon. The sun dipped lower. Shadows of skeletal skyscrapers stretched across the highway. A collapsed overpass groaned in the distance, metal and concrete hanging precariously. He could smell the decay of old asphalt, the dust of centuries of ruin, the faint metallic tang of something dead in the wind. Each inhale filled him with awareness. Each pulse of the engine synced with the rhythm of his skull's fire. He didn't stop. The last raider hesitated, realizing the pattern, but hesitation was fatal. Chains coiled around the air, finding their target with a hiss of heat. Tires burst, sparks rained, scattering metal fragments across sand and asphalt. The smell of burnt rubber stung his nostrils, mingling with the radiation lingering in the air. The rider slowed as the dust settled. Silence dropped suddenly, heavier than the roar of engines. His skull's flames dimmed to a dull, simmering glow. He felt the pulse of his own heartbeat through the bike, through the fire, through every nerve. He could taste the metallic tang of victory, but beneath it something else, the scent of the living, scattered along the edges of the desert. A small settlement appeared on the horizon, constructed from twisted metal and half-collapsed trailers. Smoke curled from a makeshift chimney. The smell of cooking meat, sweat, and fear carried across the flatlands. The rider's senses honed in. He could tell which huts held sleeping bodies, which held armed scavengers, which held those already too weak to resist the wasteland's cruelty. He slowed further, boots dragging over the asphalt, letting the bike idle, flames licking low. The wind picked up, whistling through the twisted metal, carrying a faint odor of radiation, fire, and humanity. The rider inhaled sharply, tasting the combination, feeling the dust stick to his gloves. He shifted, chains rattling, eyes narrowing beneath the blaze. He did not speak. Words had no weight here, only action. Each micro-movement, leaning, inhaling, twisting his hands, readied him, not just for survival, but for judgment. The rider's presence was a warning, silent, but absolute. And already the settlement seemed to sense it. A door creaked open, a figure peeking out, hesitating, nostrils flaring at the acrid tang rolling across the asphalt. The rider exhaled slowly, the taste of fire and dust lingering. He revved the engine, a low growl vibrating through the bones of the highway. Sparks drifted into the cooling air, mingling with smoke and ozone. The world was silent except for the hiss of heat, the crackle of fire, and the distant cry of something feral. He rolled forward, tires crunching over fractured asphalt. Sand clung to his boots, smoke stuck to his leather. The rider's skull flared higher, briefly illuminating the settlement in a hellish glow, and in that moment, the desert seemed to hold its breath. The rider crested the cracked overpass, the asphalt broken like jagged teeth beneath his tires. Dust rose in the wake of the bike, curling around the skeletal beams of the bridge. He slowed, letting the flames of his skull dim to a steady simmer, enough to illuminate the gaps in the metal above. Every surface glinted with ruin, twisted rebar, splintered concrete, sun-bleached sand settling into every crevice. Below, the settlement breathed in shallow bursts, the faint hiss of makeshift chimneys mixing with the occasional clatter of a tin bucket. The rider inhaled sharply, tasting fear in the air, sweet, acrid, and alive. Not all fear was the same. Some was primal, some calculated, and he could separate them as easily as he could pick out the faint tang of gunpowder beneath burnt meat. A woman crouched beside a barrel, her hands trembling as she stirred a pot over a flickering fire. Her scent was layered, smoke, sweat, desperation. She froze as the rider's flames flared higher, illuminating her eyes. He felt the pulse of her fear through the dusty wind, felt it like static crawling up his spine. The rider's boots scraped against the asphalt. He didn't speak. The vibration of his tires against broken concrete was enough to announce presence, a warning wrapped in fire and heat. Below, a child peeked from behind a pile of scrap metal, holding a doll whose fabric was frayed and stained. The smell of unwashed skin mixed with ash, and the rider's nostrils flared. A man shifted near the edge of a makeshift platform, clanging metal to scare away birds. The rider could detect the hesitation in his stance, the faint metallic tang of adrenaline rising in his bloodstream. Each breath the survivor took carried with it the scent of the waste around them. Dust, rust, decay, and faint chemicals from broken machinery. The rider sniffed, inhaled it all, parsing who was armed, who was weak, who was lying. He revved the engine once, low and steady, Sparks hissed from the exhaust pipe, curling into the dry wind. The woman dropped the spoon from her hand. The child ducked further behind the pile of scrap. The man on the platform froze, eyes wide, ears straining for sound. The rider's skull flickered brighter, revealing the contours of his flaming jaw in the dust-thickened light. He shifted his weight slightly, leather scraping, boots crunching gravel. The chains rattled gently against the bike frame, a warning to anyone below. He could feel the heat radiating from his own body, mixing with the midday sun, adding a taste of sulfur to the dust-laden air. A voice broke the silence, quivering. Who are you?" The words came from the man on the platform. He raised a rifle in one hand, though his grip was shaky. The rider's eyes glowed beneath the flames. He didn't answer, not yet. Instead, he leaned forward, letting the flames wash over the edge of the overpass, illuminating the entire settlement. Dust clung to his gloves, to the chains, to every curve of his bike. The child whimpered, a high, thin sound that cut across the stagnant heat. The rider caught it immediately. The scent of fear intensified, layered with sweat and dust, and he recognized it as the sort that demanded action. He shifted his jaw, flames licking the tips of his teeth. The man with the rifle trembled. We can't feed you," he said, voice cracking. His words faltered under the weight of the rider's presence, the subtle hum of fire and energy vibrating in the air. The rider exhaled slowly, letting the heat of his skull warm the breeze. He noticed the finer details. The singed ends of the woman's hair from a nearby flare, soot clinging to her clothes. The child's bare feet pressed into hot sand, soles scratched and bleeding slightly. He smelled everything, sweat, dust, fear, and let it inform his next movement. He lifted a chain, letting it drag across the asphalt in a deliberate arc. Sparks hissed, curling upward, landing near a pile of rusted scrap, clanging but harmless. A clear signal. He was aware, he was watching, but he had not yet chosen his action. The survivors held their collective breath. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of smoke from the chimneys, mingled with the metallic tang of blood already spilled somewhere in the settlement. The rider flexed his fingers around the handlebars, feeling the heat of the engine pulsing beneath him, each vibration a heartbeat. He tilted his head slightly, skull flames reflecting in shards of broken glass embedded in the concrete. His gaze swept over the settlement, picking out defensive positions, weak points, the placement of people hiding, and the stench of desperation. The woman made a small motion, standing slightly taller. We won't hurt you," she said, voice steadier now, eyes narrowing with caution. The rider's skull flickered once, brighter, as if acknowledging her honesty. He exhaled a plume of smoke through the flames, letting it drift lazily in the air between them. He shifted his bike, the gravel crunching, sand swirling, heat rolling across the overpass. The rider let the engine's low growl resonate, a warning but also a bridge, connecting him to the humans below without a word. The wind carried the faint stench of the wasteland, decay, dust, smoke, and fear, all binding them together in that tense, fragile moment. Then, without further sound, he revved the throttle lightly, flames licking higher, sending a spark of light across the settlement. The child flinched, hiding behind the scrap again, but the woman's gaze met his. The rider could sense the question lingering in the air, unspoken, friend or threat. He exhaled, fire simmering, chains rattling lightly. And in that thick, dust-choked silence, the rider waited. The gas station crouched under the broken sky like a carcass left to rot. Rusted pumps leaned at odd angles, their hoses cracked and dry. The rider's boots crunched across broken glass, each step leaving a faint trace in the fine dust. The air hummed with a metallic tang, undercut with the acidic smell of leaking fuel. He inhaled slowly, tasting ozone mingled with decay, letting his senses map the space. Barrels of green-tinged sludge oozed from the cracked concrete floor. Each drip hissed as it hit a rusted patch of metal, curling into steam that carried the sickly sweet scent of radiation. The rider's skull flared brighter as he moved forward, flames reflecting in the viscous puddles. Chains rattled against the frame, echoing faintly in the empty structure, a subtle warning in the stagnant air. A shadow moved near the back door. The rider froze, nostrils flaring. The scent of fear hit him first, sharp, acrid, mixed with sweat and gun oil. He could pick out the faint coppery tang of blood, not fresh, but enough to signal injury, desperation, and bad intent. Raiders. "Thought you'd sneak past us, huh?" a voice rasped, carrying over the hiss of leaking fuel. The words trembled with adrenaline. A figure stepped forward, leather patched with scraps of metal, helmet dented. The rifle he held shook, muzzle pointed at the rider. The rider tilted his head. His flames licked higher, casting the raider in a hellish glow. The chain on his bike rattled softly, a prelude to violence. Sparks hissed as the chain dragged over metal, echoing against the walls. The raider barked orders, and more figures emerged from the shadows. The rider counted them without moving his head. 5. Too many for a frontal attack, but too slow to escape. His nostrils flared again, detecting hesitation in their fear, a misjudgment in their stance. The first raider lunged, teeth bared under a cracked helmet, swinging a jagged pipe. The rider didn't flinch. He shifted his weight slightly, leather scraping, and the bike hummed under him. The chain lashed out, coiling around the raider's arm with a hiss of heat. Metal screeched as it met bone. The raider screamed, a high-pitched, jagged sound, and the scent of burning flesh filled the rider's nostrils. The others hesitated. One aimed a shotgun, breath ragged. The rider exhaled slowly, letting the smoke curl from his skull in a thin spiral. Flames danced along the chain as he swung it toward the next raider. Sparks erupted as it struck the metal side of a barrel, sending a hiss of green vapor into the air. The scent of ozone mixed with burning flesh, acrid and thick, clinging to his gloves and boots. A raider tried to flank him from the left. The rider leaned into the bike, flames reflecting off shards of glass on the floor. His boots scuffed, scraping gravel and metal. Chains coiled in a flash of light, wrapping around the raider's chest. Sparks hissed, metal screeched, and the raider fell, green ooze splattering across his armor. The final raider aimed his rifle with trembling hands. The rider inhaled, tasting the fear, the anticipation, the faint coppery tang of sweat. He pressed the throttle. The bike roared, flames flaring higher, reflecting off the barrels and cracked walls. He swung the chain in a wide arc, striking the barrel nearest the shooter. It tipped, green sludge spilling across the concrete. Steam hissed, mixing with ozone and burnt rubber. The raider screamed, stumbling backward, slipping in the radioactive slick. His rifle discharged, the shot clanging harmlessly against a metal beam. Sparks hissed where the chain scraped, filling the air with a mixture of heat, metal, and the faint metallic tang of blood. The rider moved with deliberate precision. He could feel the vibration of the engine under his legs, the heat of his skull burning through the leather, the rhythm of chains uncoiling like a pulse. Another raider lunged, pipe raised. The chain whipped around him, heat searing through metal and bone. Another hiss, another scream. The rider's senses drank in the smell of charred skin, ozone, and the chemical tang of spilled sludge. Smoke and green steam twisted together, catching the light of his flames in surreal ribbons. The raider's cries echoed off the cracked walls, distorted by the warped metal. One fell, the last stumbled backward, breathing ragged, chest rising and falling too fast. Fear thickened the air, clinging to the dust, to the walls, to the rider himself. He exhaled, slow, deliberate. The flames of his skull simmered back down, reflecting in the iridescent puddles of sludge. Chains rattled softly, a residual hum over the faint hiss of leaking barrels. The silence that followed was heavier than the battle itself. Dust floated lazily in the shafts of light, breaking through the broken roof. The rider shifted his boots against the asphalt, the sound sharp, deliberate. He inhaled deeply. The scent of charred flesh lingered, acrid and metallic, mixed with the green sting of radiation. The last raider whimpered, pressed against a wall, and he could taste the fear in the air like a tangible thing. The rider did not speak. He did not move toward mercy or punishment just yet. Every muscle was coiled, every sense attuned to the ambient danger. The hiss of the barrels, the smell of ozone and burnt flesh, the heat of his skull, it all spoke in a language only he could read. And for a long moment the abandoned gas station existed in suspended silence, a crucible of dust, fire, and fear. Then, without warning, he revved the engine lightly, sparks flickering into the air. The raider flinched, eyes wide, and the rider's skull flared once more, illuminating the entire room in hellish light. Silence returned, heavy and waiting, broken only by the faint sizzle of leaking sludge and the rider's slow, deliberate breathing. The rider crested a ridge of cracked asphalt and rubble. The skeletal remains of skyscrapers sprawled beneath him like abandoned bones. Glass hung in jagged shards from twisted frames, glinting in the dying light. The wind cut across the ruins, carrying with it the faint scent of scorched metal and something fouler, decay, long buried and unearthed. He inhaled sharply, letting the scent wash over him. Beneath it, faint traces of fear, desperation, and blood pressed against the edges of his senses. From the hollow streets below, a chorus of cries carried across the empty city. Shouts, screams, the clatter of metal on concrete, the sounds interlaced with a strange rhythm, the cadence of domination and suffering. The rider's skull flared, a low heat coiling up through his spine, chains rattling softly in acknowledgement. He leaned forward, gripping the handlebars tighter, boots scraping against the asphalt. Every vibration of the bike resonated through him, an echo in the fire of his skull. Below, a group of humans and mutants, scrawny, beaten, eyes wide with terror, were being herded by figures in patchwork armor. Their leader stood taller than the rest, a man with a rusted breastplate, jagged sword strapped to his back, and a pistol aimed with cruel precision. His face was obscured by a mask of dented metal, but the aura of command was unmistakable. The rider inhaled again, tasting the fear like a tangible thing on the wind. Sweat, dust, desperation, layered in complex patterns. He could tell which of the captives were too weak to resist, which had faint sparks of defiance, which would collapse under pressure. And beneath all of it, the faint metallic tang of blood, fresh and sour, laced the air. He shifted, leaning slightly to one side, letting the flames lick higher. Sparks sizzled against the asphalt as the chain coiled around the frame. His boots scraped the ridges of concrete. Every micro-movement was precise. The leader noticed him almost immediately. tilting his head as if sensing a predator in the wind. He barked orders, and the captives flinched in unison, the sound raw and human. The rider's skull flared brighter, heat radiating outward. He revved the engine lightly, and the echo rolled through the empty streets. The sound carried fear to the captives, uncertainty to the warlord. Metal scraped against metal as the chains rattled, the hiss of heat threading through the air. A young mutant, skin mottled and eyes wide, stumbled and fell, kicking up dust that clung to the rider's gloves and boots. His flame-licked chains whipped instinctively, snapping across the asphalt with a hiss. Sparks leapt from metal edges as he adjusted the trajectory. No lives were taken, yet. But the warning was clear. "Get back!" the warlord's voice barked, rifle raised, teeth bared under the mask. The captives quivered, bodies pressed together for safety. Their fear was pungent, bitter in the air, coating the rider's senses like a second skin. The rider exhaled, the smoke curling in slow spirals around his flaming skull. He felt the rhythm of the fear, the pulse of the city itself vibrating through his tires, through his boots, into every tendon and nerve. He could taste the tang of imminent violence on his tongue. He shifted his grip on the handlebars, chains rattling softly, coiling in anticipation. The warlord second in command, a stocky man with a jagged knife, stepped forward, trying to block any sudden approach. The rider tilted his head, flames reflecting in the shards of broken glass. Sparks hissed, greenish light from scattered irradiated puddles mingling with the orange flare of fire. The warlord barked another command, jerking the captives forward. One of the humans stumbled, scraping knees across metal and concrete. The rider inhaled sharply, the sharp metallic scent of blood hitting first, then the acrid bite of smoke and ozone from his own fire. His jaw flexed. The rider's boots scraped the cracked asphalt again. Chains rattled louder, flames licked higher. Each sound, each scent, each vibration coiled into a single thought. This could not stand. He revved the engine, low and deliberate. The vibration rolled across the ridge, carrying the smell of scorched rubber, ozone, and the metallic tang of death. Captives froze mid-step. The mutant child whimpered, the sound fragile and raw against the city's decay. The warlord turned fully now, eyes flicking toward the ridge. The rider inhaled the layered scents: fear, sweat, blood, anticipation, and defiance. He exhaled slowly, smoke drifting from the flaming skull, chains rattling in the thin air. Every micro-movement, lean of the bike, tilt of his head, flex of his fingers, was deliberate, calibrated, a warning and a question all at once. The choice lay bare. Act or turn away. Intervene and risk the chaos his wrath could bring, or leave them to the cruelty of the Wasteland, to the warlord's dominance, and walk away. The rider's nostrils flared, tasting the acrid mixture of blood, fear, and decay. Muscles coiled beneath leather, bones vibrating with the hum of the engine and the fire of his skull. He flexed his jaw, chains rattling. Sparks hissed against the asphalt as the first motion of intervention began, subtle, deliberate. The captives' breaths caught. The city seemed to pause, suspended in dust and flame, waiting to see which path the rider would choose. The rider paused at the mouth of the subway, where the jagged teeth of broken concrete framed the descent. Darkness pooled in the tunnels, thick and viscous, carrying with it the smell of rot and old metal. Mildew hung in the damp air, clinging to the edges of cracked tiles. He inhaled slowly, tasting the ammonia-laden stench of long-abandoned waste, mixed with the sour tang of urine and fear. His boots scuffed against gravel and broken tiles as he moved forward. Chains coiled loosely against the frame of his bike. Sparks hissed as they scraped over metal fragments, illuminating rust-streaked walls in fleeting bursts. The dim glow of his flaming skull cast long, flickering shadows, painting the tunnels in strokes of orange and black. A faint scuttle echoed from the darkness ahead. The rider tilted his head, nostrils flaring. The scent of decay sharpened, mingled with something sharper, the metallic tang of fresh blood. Coppery and bitter, mutants, small twisted forms, their eyes glinting with unnatural intelligence and hunger. He pressed forward, letting the tires crunch over broken tiles and stones. The heat of his skull radiated outward, smoke curling into the damp air, mingling with the moldy ammoniac tang of the tunnels. Every micro-movement was deliberate. Flexed fingers over the handlebars, subtle lean of the body, slight shift in weight to prepare for impact. The first mutant lunged from a shadowed alcove, claws scraping against concrete. Its breath hit him first, hot, wet, fetid, mixing ammonia and rot. The rider inhaled sharply, the scent painting a picture of its size, strength, and intent. Chains uncoiled, hissing as they scraped the walls and wrapped around the creature mid-lunge. Sparks leapt, the smell of scorched flesh mingling with the lingering odor of mildew. A low, gurgling hiss echoed from deeper in the tunnel. The rider's skull flared brighter, illuminating the skeletal columns and graffiti-streaked walls. More mutants emerged, their movements jerky, unnatural, but coordinated enough to corner him. Each step they took stirred dust, the scent of ammonia thickening in the stagnant air. He revved the engine once, low and deliberate. The vibration ran through his boots, up his spine, into every fiber of muscle. Chains rattled as he swung them toward a mutant advancing from the left. The metal screeched against bone, sparks hissed, and the smell of burnt flesh curled up his nostrils, mingling with the damp, moldy air. Another lunged from the right, claws scraping across a rusted railing. The rider shifted weight, leaning into the bike, flames licking higher. Sparks and smoke twisted in the dim light, coating the tunnel in an ephemeral haze. He struck the mutant with a coil of chain, sending it tumbling into a puddle of stagnant water. The sharp tang of ammonia stung his nose, mixed with the acrid bite of ozone from his flames. Deeper in the tunnel, the echoes of metal and guttural screams collided. The rider's skull glowed steadily, chains rattling softly, waiting, reading. Each inhale brought in more than air. The dampness of mildew, the rust of corroded beams, the faint scent of previous kills. His pulse synced with the vibration of the engine, the rhythm guiding micro-adjustments, heel tilts, subtle torso shifts, fingers tightening on grips. One mutant, larger than the rest, emerged from the darkness, eyes glinting with hunger. Its breath hit him first, sour, ammonia-heavy, mixed with the faint tang of freshly torn muscle. The rider flexed his jaw, flames licking higher, warming the tunnel walls. Chains coiled and struck, wrapping around the mutant's torso with a hiss. Sparks flew, metal scraping metal, the stench of burned flesh mingling with mildew and decay. A high-pitched shriek erupted from the far end of the tunnel, echoing off the walls. Smaller mutants scuttled back, confused by the flare of fire and the sudden burst of heat. The rider tilted his head, nostrils flaring. He could detect which were wounded, which still posed threat, which would flee at the slightest motion. He shifted forward, boots scraping, the engine humming beneath him. Each movement sent a vibration through the tunnel floor, rattling loose debris, stirring dust, and amplifying the smell of ammonia. A final mutant attempted to flank him from behind, teeth bared, claws ready. The rider twisted the chain mid-air, hissing sparks as it caught the creature across the chest. It fell, limbs splayed awkwardly, wet claws scraping against the damp tile. Silence fell. The rider exhaled slowly, smoke drifting from his flaming skull, chains rattling softly against the frame. The dim light illuminated the mutant corpses, the slick puddles of water and sludge, the rusted beams and broken tiles. The smell of burned flesh lingered sharp and acrid, layered over mildew, rust, and ammonia. He shifted his weight, boots scraping lightly against the gravel, micro-adjustments precise and deliberate. The tunnel seemed to inhale and exhale with him, the stagnant air vibrating faintly with heat, ozone, and decay. A faint scuttle in the shadows reminded him that the danger was not fully gone. The rider revved the engine once more, low, deliberate. Sparks hissed from the exhaust, curling into the damp tunnel. His skull flared higher, illuminating the depth of the subway corridor, the rusted support beams, the puddles glinting with greenish tint from residual radiation. Mutants had fallen, but the scent of ammonia and decay lingered, thick in the air, binding the space to his senses. He moved forward again, chains coiled and ready, every muscle taut, every micro-movement deliberate. The dark tunnels stretched ahead, whispering promises of more danger, more violence, and a test of restraint. He knew he would fail if he let the fire in his skull dictate his every action. And yet he inhaled the scent of fear, mildew, and ammonia, letting it guide him deeper, knowing that what awaited at the end of the tunnel would demand everything he had, and perhaps more. The tunnel opened into a cavernous space, carved from concrete and rock, walls lined with scrap metal and flickering bulbs dangling from frayed wires. The rider paused at the threshold, boots scraping gravel, letting the low hum of his engine vibrate through the floor. The smell hit first, smoke from charred wood, sweat from bodies pressed close together, and the faint, acrid bite of gunpowder clinging to every surface. He inhaled slowly, tasting each layer. The scent of fear and desperation wove through it all, mingling with the faint tang of burnt hair and iron. Muscles coiled beneath leather, eyes scanning. The flickering bulbs threw shadows across faces, haggard, alert, wary. A man stepped forward from behind a barricade of rusted barrels. His arm trembled slightly, rifle clutched tight, nostrils flaring. Sweat streaked across his grime-streaked face, mixing with the faint odor of oil from a weapon recently cleaned. "Who? What are you?" he asked, voice cracking under the weight of tension. The rider did not answer. Chains rattled softly as he flexed his fingers over the frame. Flames licked higher along his skull, painting the walls in hellish light. Sparks hissed off the metal barriers, curling into the stagnant air. The smoke from his skull twisted, blending with the smell of charred wood and sweat, thickening the air around him. A child peeked from behind a wooden post, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. He could smell her fear layered beneath the dust of the tunnels, faintly tinged with unwashed skin and rust. Another figure, a woman with a makeshift apron, clutched a rusted bucket, sweat soaking the fabric, the tang of cooking fires lingering in her hair. The rider inhaled sharply, passing every scent. "You don't belong here," the man said, stepping slightly forward. Gunpowder clung to his clothes, faint but unmistakable. His breathing was uneven. "We're armed." Chains rattled again. Sparks hissed. The rider's skull flared brighter. He leaned slightly, shifting weight on the bike, boots scuffing against gravel. Each micro-movement radiated warning. He smelled the man's hesitation, the subtle spike of fear beneath bravado. The faint metallic tang of old blood lingered on his hands, a warning of prior failures. A distant crash echoed through the tunnels, rusted metal giving way under the weight of an unstable ceiling. The survivors flinched collectively, and the rider inhaled the acrid blend of dust, sweat, and fear. The vibration of the engine resonated through the concrete floor, punctuating the silence with a low hum of latent threat. The woman with the bucket stepped closer, the scent of smoke and sweat stronger now. We just need protection," she said, voice trembling. "The tunnels, they're crawling with things. Mutants, raiders. We can't survive without someone who can—" She trailed off, glancing at the flames licking from his skull. Chains rattled softly as he tilted his head, flames reflecting in her wide eyes. He could detect the truth in her scent, the layer of fear mixed with honesty, desperation, and the faint iron tang of blood from a scraped hand. Micro-movements guided him, subtle flecks of fingers, lean of his torso, tilt of the bike's frame. He could read the room as easily as he read the pulse of the tunnel beneath him. The man with the rifle shifted his weight again, a defensive tick, scent of sweat and gunpowder spiking slightly. "We don't trust strangers," he said. The words were flat, but his fear betrayed him. The rider inhaled, tasting the layers, caution, suspicion, and the faint residue of hope beneath it all. The rider exhaled slowly, smoke curling from his flaming skull, chains rattling. Sparks hissed softly as they brushed the metal frame. Heat rolled off him in waves, stirring the stagnant air, mixing with the smell of charred wood and sweat. He flexed his jaw, flames licking higher, casting the room in an unsteady glow. One of the children whimpered, and he inhaled sharply. The scent of innocence, unwashed but untainted, cut through the smoke and fear like a sharp edge. It tugged at something deep, coiling through the fire of his skull, and he shifted forward, subtle, deliberate. Chains rattled again, warning and reassurance at once. The man with the rifle adjusted his grip, breath uneven. Gunpowder clung heavier to his clothing now, the tang sharp in the rider's nostrils. He smelled sweat mingled with residual fear, iron, and wood smoke. The rider flexed his jaw, chains rattling lightly, letting sparks drift into the air. The room held its collective breath. Finally, the rider lifted a hand slightly, motioning subtly, and the flames in his skull dimmed, heat rolling back just enough. Sparks hissed off the chain as it rested against the frame. The survivors flinched, then exhaled collectively, the tension easing just slightly. The child peeked out again, small face illuminated by flickering light. The rider revved the engine softly, letting the vibration hum through the concrete, a signal of presence and power without immediate threat. Sparks hissed from metal edges, curling through the stagnant, acrid air. Smoke drifted, mingling with the scent of sweat, charred wood, and faint gunpowder, and the rider inhaled it all, mapping the human elements, reading their truth. He moved deeper into the enclave, boots scraping gravel, chains rattling softly, flames flickering just enough to illuminate the survivors' faces. Every micro-movement, every shift of weight, every inhale and exhale was deliberate. He could smell their fear, their honesty, their unspoken questions, and he let it guide him. For the first time in a long stretch of empty tunnels and mutant hunting, the rider sensed the fragile thread of trust stretching between himself and these humans. Thin, tentative, but real. And he exhaled, smoke curling from his skull, chains rattling softly, letting the dim light mingle with sweat, charred wood, and gunpowder, waiting for the next motion, the next decision. The rider crested the broken overpass, the wind carrying a biting tang of dust and charred asphalt. Below him the void yawned, twisted steel beams jutting like skeletal ribs. The highway had long since surrendered to time and radiation. Concrete crumbled underfoot, jagged edges threatening to slice tires or boots. He could taste the acrid bite of smoke in the air, bitter and metallic, carrying the residue of old fires. Behind him, the scrape of metal on concrete, the low roar of engines cobbled from rust and scrap, told him the raiders were close. He inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring. The scent of fear and adrenaline hit him first, coppery, sharp, layered with the stench of burned oil and dust kicked up by frantic tires. Each breath mapped their movement, told him where they hesitated, where they overcommitted. The first raider leapt a collapsed section of the overpass, tires screaming against metal. Sparks erupted, clanging off twisted girders. The rider's skull flared, flames licking higher along the curve of his helmet, reflecting in the shards of broken glass scattered across the concrete. Chains rattled against the frame, ready to strike. He leaned into a curve, leather boots scraping asphalt, tires crunching gravel and sand. Every micro-movement mattered. The vibration of the engine pulsed through his hands, up his spine, sinking with the heat radiating from his skull. The flames danced across steel beams, illuminating the twisted path ahead. The scent of scorched rubber and ozone clung to his gloves and nostrils. The raiders split, one to the left, one to the right. The rider inhaled sharply, picking up subtle differences in their fear. The one on the left carried sweat thick with nervousness, the tang of gunpowder clinging faintly to his jacket. The one on the right reeked of oil and burned flesh, someone he had already maimed in a previous encounter, the scent unmistakable. He coiled the chain in a wide arc, hissing sparks as it struck the left raider's bike mid-air. Tires screamed, metal screeched. A geyser of sand and gravel erupted as the raider lost balance, scattering in the dust. The acrid smell of burning rubber and faint ozone filled the rider's nostrils. The second raider lunged toward him, trying to flank from the right. The rider leaned forward, boots scraping jagged edges of asphalt, fingers flexing over the grips. Chains rattled against the frame, coiling and uncoiling like a living thing. Sparks hissed, scattering across rusted girders. Flames reflected in shards of broken glass, painting the raider in hellish orange. The raider twisted, tires skidding over loose debris. The rider anticipated the motion, swinging the chain in a controlled arc. Sparks hissed as it connected with the metal, the smell of scorched steel and ozone filling his nostrils. The raider screeched, the sound raw and jagged, and his bike wobbled perilously over the fractured edge of the overpass. The rider's skull flared higher, heat rolling off in waves, smoke curling into the wind. Every micro-movement, the tilt of his torso, the subtle press of his boots, the flex of his fingers, kept him balanced over broken concrete, over gaps that could swallow him or his enemies. The roar of the engine mixed with the hiss of sparks, a harmony of fire and metal against the quiet of the desolate city below. A third raider appeared at the far end of the overpass, holding a shotgun, teeth bared beneath a dented helmet. The rider inhaled sharply, the smell of sweat, gunpowder, and fear hitting him in waves. He pressed the throttle, tires crunching over the fractured surface, sending a cascade of gravel and metal fragments into the void. Chains rattled, uncoiling with a hiss, coiling around the shotgun barrel mid-air. Sparks erupted, scorching metal, the acrid scent of ozone and smoke mixing in the air. The raider flinched, slipping, losing grip of the weapon. Coppery sweat stung the rider's nostrils, layered over the acrid bite of burning tires. The first two raiders scrambled to recover, swerving over exposed beams. The rider leaned forward, flames licking higher, chains coiling around the first raider's torso with a hiss of heat. Sparks erupted, sizzling against metal, and the smell of charred rubber and faint flesh reached his nose. He twisted, the chain snapping the second raider's handlebars, sending him tumbling toward the edge, dust and gravel erupting like miniature explosions. The final raider tried one last maneuver, accelerating over a collapsed section. The rider inhaled sharply, reading the motion, the scent of adrenaline, fear, and sweat guiding his reaction. Chains whipped out, striking the bike mid-air, sparks flying, tires bursting. The smell of burned rubber, ozone, and faint metallic tang of blood hit the rider's senses in sharp waves. He revved the engine once, low and deliberate, chains rattling softly against the frame. The wind carried the scent of scorched asphalt, dust, and smoke into his nostrils. Below, the city lay in ruin, skeletal towers stretching into the dying light. Raiders had fled or fallen, leaving only the whisper of scorched tires and faint hiss of sparks behind. The rider inhaled, tasting the acrid residue of battle, the metallic tang of fear and adrenaline still lingering. He exhaled, smoke curling from his flaming skull, chains rattling softly. Every micro-movement, tilt of the head, shift of weight, press of boots, released tension without sound, leaving only the roar of flames and the hum of the engine. He leaned back, surveying the fractured overpass. Sparks hissed, smoke twisted, and the acrid scent of burnt rubber and ozone lingered in the wind. The rider flexed his fingers over the grips, chains rattling softly. Somewhere below, a distant scream echoed from the ruined streets, fading into silence. The path ahead stretched jagged and uncertain, but he pressed forward, flames licking higher, boots scraping gravel, chains coiling, ready for the next confrontation. The rider rolled into the junkyard, the heat of the afternoon sun pressing down like a weight. Rusted car roofs gleamed with the faint orange of his flaming skull, chains rattling softly as his tires crunched over broken glass and metal scraps. The acrid scent of scorched metal mingled with the sharper tang of rust, metallic and sharp on his tongue, clinging to every inhale. Every surface vibrated under his boots, warped sheet metal, sand-packed tires, fractured concrete. Sparks hissed from the chain brushing a jagged edge of steel, the hiss slicing the thick heat like a whisper of warning. The rider's skull flared higher, flames licking the contours of rusted hoods, casting long, trembling shadows across piles of debris. Movement flickered in the corners of his vision. Raiders or scavengers, indistinct in their patchwork armor, scuttled between car heaps, their breaths ragged. Sweat, dust, and fear clung to them in palpable layers. The rider inhaled sharply, tasting the metallic tang of blood beneath the acrid dust, feeling hesitation in their movements. Their heat, their fear, their anticipation carried across the sun-baked yard straight to his nostrils. A man with a makeshift flamethrower stepped atop a rusted bus, aiming in the rider's direction. The smell of fuel, sharp and biting, mixed with sweat and dust, hit him first. Sparks hissed from the chain as he flexed his fingers over the handlebars, micro-adjustments in weight and posture preparing for motion. He exhaled slowly, smoke curling from the flaming skull, heat radiating in waves over the jagged surfaces around him. Every vibration, engine, chain, and asphalt beneath tires rippled through his legs and spine. The rider tilted his head, nostrils flaring, reading each micro-movement in the scavengers, where their fear faltered, where their confidence overreached, where desperation drove them toward reckless action. The first figure lunged, feet kicking up sand and shards of metal. The rider's chain coiled instinctively, hissing sparks as it wrapped around the man's torso. The smell of scorched clothing, acrid and metallic, hit his nose in tandem with the hiss of fire. Heat radiated from his skull, reflecting in rusted hoods and twisted metal beams, illuminating every jagged edge, every weak point. A second scavenger raised a pipe, sweat and oil tangling with dust in the air. The rider flexed his jaw, flames licking higher. Chains rattled against the bike frame as he shifted weight, leaning forward, boots scraping glass and metal. Sparks leapt off the chain as it caught the pipe mid-swing, sending the figure sprawling into a heap of metal scraps. The smell of burnt metal, faint ozone, and the sharp tang of iron filled the rider's nostrils, layering with the dust-choked heat of the yard. Movement flickered beyond a pile of irradiated barrels. A third scavenger attempted to flank from behind a stack of crushed cars. The rider inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring at the mixture of fear, sweat, and gunpowder. He pressed the throttle, engine growling, boots scraping gravel. Chains coiled, sizzling sparks as they connected with a metal beam near the figure, sending a shower of debris and dust into the air. The acrid tang of burnt rubber and scorched metal layered with faint sweat filled the rider's senses. He paused briefly, boots digging into sand, flames flickering along his skull, letting the echoes of hissing sparks and clattering metal roll across the yard. He tasted the anticipation, the tension, the fine line between domination and destruction. Another breath, slow and deliberate, carried in the faint scent of fear, dust, and the promise of violence. From atop a rusted car pile, a scavenger with a makeshift rifle aimed. The rider inhaled sharply, tasting the gunpowder and sweat, reading the twitch in his stance. Chains rattled, uncoiling with a hiss, wrapping around a rusted post and swinging toward the shooter. Sparks hissed, metal screeched, the acrid tang of heat and ozone rising into the heavy air. The scavenger flinched, rifle firing into the sky, metal pinging against rusted roofs. The rider's skull flared brighter, heat rolling off him in waves, illuminating the piles of junk and the scattered combatants. He moved forward, chains rattling, micro shifts in posture, boots scraping jagged metal, engine humming low. Sparks hissed, the smell of burnt metal sharp and sweet against the lingering tang of rust, dust, and fear. Two scavengers lunged simultaneously, desperation radiating from them in hot metallic waves. The rider flexed his fingers, coils uncoiling like serpents. Sparks hissed against metal beams, the tang of scorched metal, ozone, and blood filling his nostrils. Chains struck with precision, scattering the figures across heaps of junk. The acrid heat of his skull mixed with the sun-baked metal scent, thickening the air like smoke in a furnace. He exhaled, smoke curling from the flaming skull, chains rattling softly as the yard fell silent but for the hum of his engine and the hiss of residual sparks. The heat of the sun-baked debris radiated back at him, metallic tang lingering on his gloves, boots, and tongue. The scavengers lay sprawled, defeated, fear coating the yard like dust. The rider paused at the center of the junkyard, surveying the heaps of rust, twisted metal, and broken dreams. Sparks hissed softly, smoke curling from his skull, heat radiating into the dense air. Every inhale, every scent, every micro-movement, dust, rust, scorched metal, sweat and fear fed into him. And beneath it all, a faint, lingering thrill, the taste of power, the temptation to push further. For a long moment the yard waited with him suspended in dust, sparks, and heat. The rider exhaled slowly, smoke curling, chains rattling softly, and the metallic tang of rust, scorched metal, and fear clung to him like a second skin. The wasteland whispered its challenges, and he had already accepted them. The rider's tires crunched over cracked, sun-baked earth, each rotation sending up thin clouds of dust that clung to his boots and leather. The wind carried a sharp tang of sulfur from irradiated patches, mixing with ozone curling off the heat of his flaming skull. He inhaled slowly, letting the smells map the flats before him. Scorched metal from wrecked cars, faint coppery tang of old blood, dust thick enough to coat the tongue. In the distance, a convoy of raiders moved across the flats, engines sputtering and creaking, patchwork vehicles haphazardly welded together. Their motion stirred more dust, thickening the air, and the rider detected it first, not by sight, but by scent. Sweat, oil, fear, and the metallic tang of blood already shed lingered faintly, clinging to each vehicle. He could read their hesitation and arrogance layered in the stench. He leaned forward, the bike humming beneath him. Every vibration ran through his legs and spine, sinking with the heat of his skull. Chains rattled softly against the frame, subtle warning against the background hiss of tires scraping dry earth. Sparks hissed as they brushed metal fragments scattered across the flats. One raider glanced back, nostrils flaring. The rider inhaled sharply, detecting the spike of fear in the air, the faint coppery aroma of panic mingling with the burnt tang of fuel. The convoy shifted, engines whining, tires screeching over broken asphalt and debris. He pressed the throttle, boots scraping gravel and dust. Flames licked higher along his skull, heat radiating outward in waves. Sparks hissed against exposed bolts and jagged metal. The sulfur tang of radiation stung his nose, layered with the acrid bite of ozone and faint scent of scorched metal from his chains. A vehicle swerved toward a collapsed overpass, kicking up a storm of sand and rust flakes. The rider leaned into the turn, chains rattling, fingers flexing over grips. He inhaled the faint stench of the raider's sweat and fear, mapping motion with precision. Sparks hissed as a metal fragment from a broken railing hit the chain, leaving a curl of smoke and ozone in the air. The lead raider fired a shotgun, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the wind, mixing with sweat and the ozone of the rider's flames. Shotgun blasts pinged off twisted metal, sending fragments skittering across the cracked ground. The rider twisted slightly, boots pressing down, flames reflecting off exposed metal in the distance. Each inhalation filled him with layered information: fear, intent, injury, and hesitation. Another raider fell behind, his engine sputtering. The rider's skull flared brighter, heat rolling outward, smoke curling across the flats. Sparks hissed as chains uncoiled, wrapping around the back wheel of the lagging vehicle. Tires screeched, metal scraped metal, the acrid scent of burnt rubber mixing with the sulfur and ozone already heavy in the air. He exhaled slowly, letting the smoke drift, tasting the acrid mixture of dust, scorched metal, and faint blood. Every micro-movement, tilt of torso, shift of boots, flex of fingers, was precise, deliberate, controlled. Sparks hissed as chains struck metal beams, punctuating each inhale with a whisper of warning. The convoy faltered at a jagged ridge of broken highway. Tires skidded, kicking up dust. The riders' nostrils flared, sensing a weakness in their motion, the subtle scent of panic layered beneath the usual fear and sweat. Flames flickered higher along his skull, chains rattling with intent. Sparks hissed, scattering dust and sand, reflecting orange light against rusted hoods and fractured steel. A rear vehicle lurched over a sun-bleached skeleton of a truck, engine whining, metal screeching against metal. The rider coiled his chain, hissing sparks as it struck the rear axle. Tires spun, dust exploded, and the acrid scent of burnt rubber and scorched metal filled the air. The driver flinched, inhaling sharply, fear radiating in waves that the rider felt in his chest. He pressed forward, boots scraping, chains rattling, skull flaring in measured heat. Sparks hissed across twisted metal and broken concrete. The sulfur tang of irradiated soil stung his nostrils, mingling with a faint smell of sweat and adrenaline from the raiders. Dust clung to gloves, leather, boots. Every vibration, every micro shift of weight, every subtle twist of the bike carried information, guiding each movement with precision. The last vehicle veered to avoid debris. The rider leaned into the motion, chains lashing across the exposed steel frame, sparks hissing, heat rolling across the flats. The scent of scorched metal and ozone clung to him, mingling with the faint metallic tang of blood and dust. The convoy slowed, hesitation evident, fear rising in sharp, coppery layers he could taste in the air. He exhaled, smoke curling from his flaming skull, chains rattling softly, engine humming low. The flats lay behind the fallen dust clouds, the convoy scattered, fear lingering in the wind. The rider's skull flared, heat rolling across his shoulders, gloves coated in fine dust. The sulphury tang of radiation and acrid ozone lingered in the air, marking the path he had carved across the irradiated earth. The horizon stretched endless, cracked and sun-bleached. The raiders were still ahead, but he had marked their weakness. He inhaled deeply, tasting dust, scorch, and fear, micro-adjusting weight and balance, readying for the pursuit to continue, knowing the full weight of the wasteland awaited him at every turn. The rider arrived at the compound as the sun dipped low, smoke curling from scorched vehicles and makeshift barricades. The air was thick with the acrid tang of burning oil, gunpowder, and charred flesh. He inhaled slowly, letting the layers map the battlefield. Fear, sweat, desperation, and the faint metallic tang of blood mingling with the acrid smoke. Rusted walls leaned at dangerous angles, punctuated by jagged debris. The heat from his flaming skull rippled outward, reflecting in shattered glass and scorched metal. Chains rattled softly against the frame as he shifted weight, boots scraping cracked asphalt, every micro-movement precise and deliberate. Sparks hissed as they brushed twisted metal, scent of scorched steel mixing with the oil and gunpowder already thick in the air. From the compound's central tower, the warlord emerged, breastplate dented, sword strapped to his back, pistol in hand. The rider smelled him first, sweat, leather, gunpowder, and a faint, metallic hint of past violence. The warlord barked orders, herding captives like cattle, their fear sharp and palpable, curling into the rider's nostrils like smoke. The rider exhaled slowly, smoke drifting from his flaming skull. Sparks hissed from the chain as he flexed fingers over the frame, coiling it like a living thing. Heat radiated in waves, carrying the faint metallic tang of charred flesh, burnt clothing, and scorched tires. The warlord fired a shot, gunpowder biting the air, but the rider's skull flared higher, heat radiating outward, chains uncoiling, wrapping around a support beam. Sparks hissed as the metal struck, sending shrapnel clattering against the compound walls. Dust, soot, and the acrid tang of burning oil filled the air. He shifted slightly, boots scraping debris, body tilting, chains rattling. Sparks hissed from each contact with metal, reflecting in the charred skeletal frames of barricades and scorched vehicles. The captives froze, pressed against walls, their breaths sharp and wet with fear. The warlord advanced, sword drawn, movements deliberate. The rider inhaled, nostrils flaring. The metallic tang of blood clung faintly to the warlord's leather armor, sweat rising in sharp layers. Chains coiled, hissing sparks as they struck the ground near the advancing figure. Flames licked higher along the rider's skull, casting elongated shadows over rubble and debris. A sudden lunge. The rider twisted the chain, sparks hissing, wrapping around the warlord's sword arm. The weapon clanged against metal, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Burning oil from a nearby barrel hissed, acrid smoke filling the air. The rider smelled the faint coppery tang of blood where flesh had met metal, layered with gunpowder and sweat. The warlord grunted, swinging free with the other arm, scraping concrete, sparks flying. The rider shifted weight, boots scrabbling, chains rattling, flames reflecting in shards of glass. He leaned into the swing, coiling chains to strike. Sparks hissed, heat rolling outward. The scent of scorched metal, oil, and charred flesh layered into a dense fog, clinging to boots, gloves, and leather. Gunfire erupted behind the warlord, raiders trying to intervene, but the rider inhaled the tension in the air, sweat, gunpowder, and fear. Flames licked higher, chains uncoiling with a hiss. Sparks hit rusted metal beams, reflecting in broken glass, scent of ozone mingling with acrid smoke. He pressed forward, micro shifts in torso, subtle heel adjustments, fingers flexing. The warlord twisted, knife flashing from the belt. Chains rattled as they coiled, striking the weapon away, sparks hissing. He smelled the desperation in the warlord's breath, sweat mixing with metallic tang of old wounds. Flames danced across the compound, illuminating the captives, frozen and trembling. A deafening crash. The rider slammed the chain into a fuel drum. Explosive sparks, fire curling, acrid smoke twisting into the dusky sky. Heat rolled across the compound, burning metal, oil, and charred flesh, mingling into a dense, suffocating layer. The captives screamed, bodies pressed into corners, fear tangible in the smoke-thickened air. The warlord faltered, body pressed against coiling chains. The rider tilted his head, nostrils flaring at the metallic tang of blood and sweat. At the rising fear, tasting the consequences of action and inaction alike. Micro shifts of weight, subtle flexing of fingers, the coiling of chains, all deliberate, all precise. Sparks hissed against metal debris, acrid heat rolling across the compound. Finally, the chains wrapped tight around the warlord, binding movement, hissing sparks filling the air. The rider's skull flared brighter, heat radiating outward. Smoke twisted, carrying with it the acrid tang of burned flesh, oil, and gunpowder, the faint metallic trace of blood sharp against his senses. He exhaled slowly, letting the silence settle, letting the captives breathe, letting the compound digest the weight of his arrival. The point of no return had been crossed. The rider inhaled deep, tasting dust, fear, and scorched metal. Chains rattling softly, flames licking higher. The warlord's reign ended in the acrid haze of fire and smoke, and the rider's presence remained, unchallenged, unstoppable, a new apex in the Wasteland hierarchy. For the first time, he smelled the lingering scent of victory, but beneath it, the faint metallic tang of the choices yet to come. The fires burned low, smoldering across the ruined compound, curling tendrils of smoke into the twilight sky. The rider inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring at the acrid bite of burnt flesh, the tang of gunpowder still lingering, the faint metallic note of blood hovering beneath it. His skull flared briefly, heat radiating outward, chains rattling softly against the frame of his bike as he scanned the ruin for movement. From the shadows of twisted metal and scorched vehicles, a low, gurgling sound rose. Mutants, twisted and scarred by radiation, emerged from crumbling walls and half-collapsed barricades. Their breaths hit first, sour, ammonia-heavy, tinged with rot. The rider inhaled sharply, tasting the acrid mixture layered with the metallic tang of old wounds. Spark hissed as chains brushed the jagged edges of debris, illuminating the uneven ground in flickers of orange and gold. Raiders, fewer but still dangerous, regrouped atop rubble piles, pistols and rifles trembling in hands slick with sweat and oil. He inhaled the gunpowder and fear, sharp and metallic against the tang of burnt flesh and scorched metal. The vibration of the engine pulsed through him, resonating in boots and spine, sinking with the heat of his flaming skull. Every micro-movement, subtle tilt of the torso, flex of fingers, shift of boots, was a silent reading of danger, preparing for the inevitable clash. One mutant lunged from the shadows, claws scraping metal and concrete. The acrid tang of ammonia mixed with the metallic bite of blood as the rider's chain coiled, hissing sparks as it struck. Metal screeched, the mutant screamed, and the smell of burnt flesh hit his nostrils, layered over the acrid smoke of burning debris. A raider fired a shot, the scent of gunpowder sharp and immediate, mingling with sweat and dust. The rider twisted his bike, leaning low, chains rattling as sparks hissed against rusted beams. Flames licked higher along his skull, reflecting off jagged metal, illuminating the mutants' twisted faces and the raider's terror-stricken eyes. Another mutant charged from the left, teeth bared, breath hot, fetid, thick with rot and ammonia. The rider flexed fingers over the chain, coiling it deliberately. Sparks hissed as it struck a metal post, ricocheting toward the creature, the acrid tang of ozone and charred flesh curling in the heat of his skull. Micro shifts in posture, subtle presses of the boots against gravel and debris, controlled his center of gravity as the mutant crashed into the chain, scattering dust and sparks into the acrid air. From the right, a raider swung a jagged pipe. Sweat, oil, and gunpowder hit the rider first, sharp and metallic. Chains rattled as he twisted toward, sparks hissing, coiling the metal around the weapon. He tilted his head, inhaling the layered scents, fear, adrenaline, sweat, and faint metallic tang of blood. Flames licked higher, illuminating shattered windows and scorched vehicles in flickering bursts. The mutants and raiders hesitated as he advanced, heat rolling in waves, smoke curling from the skull, chains rattling in measured bursts. Each inhalation brought new detail. Which mutants were wounded, which raiders hesitated, which would break first. Sparks hissed as chains struck metal fragments, the acrid tang of burnt flesh and scorched metal mingling with gunpowder, sweat, and ammonia-heavy mutant breath. He shifted forward, boots scraping debris, fingers flexing, chains coiling like a living thing. A mutant lunged high, claws scraping the overhang. Sparks hissed, chains striking precisely, the metallic tang of burnt flesh sharp against ozone and smoke. The creature fell, gurgling, leaving a faint ammonia tang in the air. Another raider tried to flank from behind. The rider tilted his head, nostrils flaring, reading micro-movements and inhaling the coppery tang of fear mixed with sweat. Chains coiled, hissing sparks as they wrapped around the raider's torso, the acrid stench of burning fabric and rubber filling the air. Flames from the skull licked across the walls, reflecting in puddles of spilled fuel and rusted metal. For a long moment, the compound hung in suspended violence, mutants writhing, raiders groaning, smoke curling, chains rattling, sparks hissing. The rider exhaled slowly, heat rolling across the ruins, every micro-movement deliberate, reading, adjusting, controlling the chaos. The acrid tang of burned flesh, gunpowder, rust, and sweat thickened in the air, clinging to boots, gloves, and leather. The last raider fell back, trembling, gun clattering against debris. The mutants hesitated, snarling and twitching, still dangerous but aware of the infernal presence moving among them. The rider inhaled sharply, tasting dust, fear, burnt flesh, and ozone, letting the sense anchor him in the aftermath of the fight. Sparks hissed softly from coiled chains, flames flickered, and the compound lay momentarily subdued under the oppressive heat of his skull. He exhaled, smoke curling from the flaming skull, chains rattling softly. Every vibration, every micro-shift of posture, every inhale carried the weight of action and consequence. He smelled the lingering tang of blood, burnt metal, gunpowder, and sweat, the cost of his intervention. For the first time, he felt the weight of crossing the point of no return. The survivors were safe for now, but the wasteland had marked him, and the retaliation would only grow fiercer. Sparks hissed, smoke drifted, and the rider's flaming skull glowed in the acrid twilight, a warning and a promise that his path through the irradiated earth was irreversible. The rider emerged from the smoldering ruins, boots scraping ash and fragmented concrete, chains rattling softly against the frame of his bike. Smoke curled from scorched debris, carrying the acrid tang of burnt flesh, oil, and charred metal. A faint, sweet metallic note clung to the air, the coppery hint of blood, fresh enough to trigger awareness, distant but unmistakable. Across the plains beyond the compound, movement stirred in the hazy sunlight. Mutants and raiders regrouped, silhouetted against the faint green glow rising from irradiated pools. The rider inhaled sharply, tasting the layered scents: sweat, fear, gunpowder, rust, and the acrid bite of scorched metal from his own bike. The vibration of the engine pulsed through him, sinking with the heat of his flaming skull. He tilted his head, nostrils flaring. One group of mutants crawled over debris, ammonia-heavy breath curling into the stagnant air. Their twisted limbs scraped against rubble, the acrid metallic tang of old injuries and rot trailing behind them. Raiders crested ridges on makeshift vehicles, sweat and oil mingling with the faint gunpowder lingering from prior skirmishes. Sparks hissed as chains brushed jagged metal, flames flickering against rusted beams. The rider exhaled slowly, smoke curling from the flaming skull, heat rolling outward, chains rattling softly. Every micro-movement, subtle heel shifts, torso tilts, flexing of fingers, kept him balanced over uneven ground, mapping the terrain, reading the sense of intent. A screech split the air, a mutant child terrified, separated from the survivors hidden in the ruins. The rider inhaled sharply, the sweet tang of blood faint but rising in his awareness. Sparks hissed as chains uncoiled reflexively, striking a nearby jagged beam to warn off an approaching raider. Flames licked higher, casting flickering shadows over sand, metal, and jagged concrete. The raiders advanced, guns raised, the scent of sweat, gunpowder, and fear sharp in his nostrils. Mutants closed in from the other side, claws scraping concrete, ammonia-heavy breath thickening the haze. The rider flexed fingers, tilting his head, reading the layered intentions in scent and movement. Sparks hissed as chains rattled against metal, the heat of his skull reflecting off rusted beams and jagged wrecks. A choice lay before him, tangible in every inhalation. Pursue vengeance, drive them from the plains with fire and metal, or protect the scattered survivors, innocent, fragile, unaware of the danger crawling closer. The rider exhaled, smoke curling, tasting dust, scorch, and blood. Every micro-movement became a silent calculation. Lean slightly, flex just so, coiling chains to redirect rather than strike. One raider tried to flank toward a survivor shelter, engine whining, tires skidding over gravel and debris. The rider tilted his head, nostrils flaring at the metallic spike of adrenaline and sweat, gunpowder still clinging faintly to clothes. He coiled a chain, sparks hissing as it struck a metal post, sending the raider skidding off course. The acrid smell of ozone mingled with the metallic tang of sweat and the faint, sweet hint of blood. Mutants pressed in, snarling, ammonia-heavy breath curling through the haze. He inhaled sharply, reading micro-movements, hesitation, aggression, desperation. Flames licked higher along his skull, reflecting orange light in the ruined landscape. Chains rattled softly, wrapping around a mutant's torso mid-lunge, sparks hissing, scent of charred flesh sharp against the tang of ozone. He shifted forward, boots scraping fragmented concrete, micro-adjustments precise, controlled, deliberate. Smoke from his skull coiled upward, curling with acrid haze of burning debris. The survivors huddled in the ruins, faces pale, sweat and fear layering the air around them. The rider tasted it, mapping urgency against threat. A raider attempted a desperate swerve toward the survivors, engine screeching, gun raised. The rider tilted the bike, chains coiling, spark hissing against rusted beams. Heat rolled outward in waves, acrid tang of burned metal, ozone, and faintly sweet blood mingling. The raider was forced away, skidding over loose gravel, tires throwing dust and debris. Mutants hesitated, sensing dominance but still dangerous. The rider inhaled sharply, tasting ammonia, sweat, scorched metal, and the lingering copper tang of blood. He flexed fingers, tilted slightly, every movement controlled, coiled chains ready to strike only if necessary. Flames from the skull flickered, illuminating shadows across sand, debris, and twisted metal. For a long moment the plains hung suspended in layered tension. Smoke, scorched metal, blood, ammonia, dust, and the faint, acrid bite of ozone. The rider exhaled slowly, chains rattling softly, micro-adjustments in posture, subtle shifts in weight, fingers flexing. The mutants and raiders hesitated, caught between fear and aggression, aware that this infernal presence would not hesitate. The survivors stirred slightly, recognizing the protection, the boundary drawn by fire, chains, and presence. The rider inhaled deep, tasting dust, smoke, sweat, and blood, coiling energy, reading every scent, every movement, every intention. He had chosen the path of protection, yet the taste of vengeance lingered faintly on the air, a reminder that the wasteland would always demand more. He exhaled, smoke curling from the flaming skull, chains rattling softly, heat radiating outward. Sparks hissed as the metal scraped debris. Across the irradiated plains, the raiders and mutants reconsidered their approach, hesitation layering fear over aggression. The rider remained in motion, a slow, deliberate advance, tasting the acrid air, the tang of blood, the scent of sweat and fear, the consequences of his choice pressing in on all sides. The rider thundered across the cracked flats, tires skimming over broken asphalt and sun-baked rubble. Sparks hissed as chains brushed jagged metal remnants, curling into the air in flickering orange streaks. The acrid tang of scorched metal and ozone clung to his gloves and boots, mixed with a faint coppery hint of blood carried by the wind. Each inhale mapped the chaos before him. Mutants creeping from shadows, raiders sprawled across twisted vehicles, engines whining in uneven rhythm. He leaned low, flames licking higher along his skull, heat rolling outward in waves. Dust and ash swirled around boots and tires, tasting faintly of sweat and metal. The first mutant lunged from a fractured overpass, claws scraping concrete. Ammonia-heavy breath hit first, sour and thick. Chains rattled as they coiled, sparks hissing when they struck the creature mid-lunge. The metallic tang of scorched flesh cut through the acrid ozone, layering in his nostrils with a precise intensity. A raider fired, gunpowder acrid and immediate, the smell sharp against the lingering smoke of burned vehicles. The rider twisted the bike, tilting forward, chains coiling, heat radiating outward. Sparks hissed as the chain struck rusted metal near the shooter, sending him tumbling into a shallow puddle of irradiated water. The scent of sulfur rose from the puddle, sharp and biting, mixed with the acrid tang of burned rubber and scorched metal. Mutants pressed from both flanks, their movements jerky, limbs twisted and scarred. The rider inhaled sharply, reading the ammonia, rot, and faint iron tang of old wounds. Micro-adjustments guided every motion, flecks of fingers, subtle lean of torso, slight shifts in boots. Chains rattled softly, coiling, striking, hissing sparks as they wrapped around limbs and debris, controlling the battlefield with precision. One mutant barreled toward a fallen raider, teeth bared, breath hot and sour. The rider twisted chains mid-air, sparks hissing, striking the mutant across the back. It screeched, claws scraping concrete, the acrid scent of burnt flesh mixing with ozone and sulfur. Boots scraped gravel and jagged metal, engine humming low, micro-movements threading him through chaos like a conductor of violence. A raider attempted a flanking maneuver, engine whining, tires skidding across fractured asphalt. Sweat and gunpowder hit the rider's nostrils, mingling with the acrid bite of ozone and the metallic tang of blood from previous skirmishes. Flames from his skull flickered across rusted wreckage, illuminating jagged edges and twisted metal. Chains coiled, sparks hissed, striking metal debris to deflect the raider's path. The rider inhaled again, deep-tasting layered scents. Fear, sweat, blood, ozone, scorched metal. Each micro-movement became a calculated reaction, slight heel tilt, subtle torso lean, precise flexing of fingers. Sparks hissed, chains coiled, heat rolled across him, smoke curling in flickering ribbons across the flats. The mutants and raiders hesitated for a fraction of a second, a heartbeat enough for the rider to redirect momentum. Another raider lunged from behind a pile of wreckage, swinging a jagged pipe. The rider twisted, coiling the chain, sparks hissing as metal struck metal. The acrid tang of burned metal, ozone, and sweat layered in his nostrils. Flames licked higher along his skull, heat radiating outward, dust swirling across boots, chains rattling softly. The raider staggered back, falling to the cracked earth with a grunt, sweat and blood mingling with the sulfur-heavy air. A group of mutants surged from the left, ammonia-heavy breaths curling in waves, claws scraping concrete. The rider inhaled sharply, tasting the coppery tang of blood, acrid ozone, and the sulfur-laced dust of the flats. Chains uncoiled, coiling around metal beams, striking mutants mid-lunge. Sparks hissed, metal screeched, the acrid bite of scorched flesh rising above sulfur and ozone. Each micro-adjustment kept him balanced, precise, untouchable. The ground trembled as a larger raider, wielding a makeshift flamethrower, advanced from the far ridge. The heat from the flames mixed with the scent of oil and sweat, acrid and sharp. The rider inhaled sharply, detecting the hesitation beneath bravado, reading micro-movements. He coiled a chain, sparks hissing, striking a rusted beam to deflect the flamethrower's nozzle. Smoke, acrid and thick, rolled across the plains, carrying ozone, burnt metal, and faintly sweet blood. For a suspended moment, the irradiated flats hung in layered tension. Mutants snarling, raiders trembling, fire licking debris, chains coiling and hissing sparks. The rider exhaled, smoke curling from his flaming skull, micro shifts of torso, subtle heel presses, fingers flexing, each movement deliberate. He smelled fear, sweat, scorched metal, and blood, the combined weight of action and consequence. Finally, with a low hiss, chains wrapped around the largest mutant and the lead raider's legs simultaneously, sending both crashing to the cracked earth. Sparks hissed against metal, heat rolling outward, acrid tang of burnt flesh and scorched metal mixing with ozone and sulfur. Flames flickered across the flats, illuminating the conquered battlefield. The rider exhaled, smoke curling, chains rattling softly. His skull flared brighter, heat radiating outward, the acrid metallic sense of blood, burned flesh, ozone and sulfur lingering in the air. The point of no return had solidified. The Wasteland now recognized him, not just as predator, not just as hunter, but as something inhuman, unstoppable, a force that reshaped the plains wherever he roamed. He inhaled deep, tasting dust, sweat, scorch, and blood, coiling energy for the next move. Sparks hissed softly, flames flickered, and across the irradiated flats, mutants and raiders alike hesitated, aware of the infernal presence that had irrevocably changed their world. The rider lingered at the edge of the smoldering ruins, tires crunching ash and fractured concrete under leather boots. Smoke from the compound's remains curled upward, carrying the acrid tang of charred metal and burnt flesh. Every inhale tasted layers of destruction, coppery blood, scorched metal, and faint ozone from lingering sparks. His flaming skull reflected off jagged debris, casting flickering shadows across the fractured flats. From the distance, howls rose, mutants regrouping, their ammonia-heavy breaths thick in the cooling air. The rider's nostrils flared, reading each scent in the darkening light. Sweat, fear, and faint gunpowder clung to the raiders retreating behind rubble. Sparks hissed softly as chains brushed jagged metal, echoing across broken concrete. Heat radiated outward in waves, mingling with the heavy smoke, thick and suffocating. A scuttling movement caught his attention. A small mutant, wounded, dragged itself across debris, ammonia tang-strong, rot clinging to shredded skin. The rider tilted slightly, flexing fingers over chains, micro-adjustments in posture balancing weight, reading its motion. Sparks hissed as the chain lashed out, striking the mutant mid-lunge. A faint copper tang rose as it fell, acrid smoke curling into the cooling dusk. Beyond the mutant, raiders crept over sun-baked rubble, rifles trembling in hands slick with sweat and oil. Gunpowder mingled with the scent of charred metal and the faint tang of blood. The rider exhaled slowly, smoke curling from his skull. Heat rolled outward in waves, engine humming low, chains rattling softly. Each micro-movement, tilt of the torso, press of boots, and subtle flex of fingers guided him through the chaos. A distant screech rose from the flats. A large mutant, scarred and twisted, lunging at the survivors hidden in the debris. The rider tilted forward, chains coiling, sparks hissing against exposed steel. Acrid tang of burnt metal, ozone, and scorched flesh hit his senses in sharp layers. He read the micro-movements, hesitation, aggression, desperation. Flames licked higher along his skull, illuminating the mutant's writhing form against the shadows of the ruins. The survivors, huddled behind wreckage, whimpered, faces pale, sweat streaked across dirt and ash. The rider inhaled the scent of fear, sweat and dust, mapping urgency against threat. Sparks hissed as chains struck metal, coiling around debris to block the mutant's path. Heat radiated in waves, acrid and sharp, mingling with the lingering smell of scorched flesh. One raider tried to flank, engine whining, tires skidding across fractured concrete. The rider tilted slightly, nostrils flaring, tasting coppery fear, gunpowder and sweat. Chains coiled, sparks hissed as they struck a rusted post, sending the raider skidding back. Acrid smoke rolled across the flats, tang of burned metal sharp against the faintly sweet copper of blood lingering in the air. Mutants surged, ammonia-heavy breath thick in the cooling dusk. The rider exhaled, flames flickering, chains rattling softly. Boots scraped jagged rubble, micro-adjustments keeping balance, flexing fingers over the grips. Sparks hissed against twisted metal as he guided mutants away from survivors, reading every motion, every scent. The acrid mixture of scorched flesh, dust, blood, and ozone filled the air, clinging to leather, gloves, and boots. A larger raider, wielding a jagged pipe, lunged from behind a rusted vehicle. Sweat, oil, and gunpowder mingled with the tang of scorched metal. The rider coiled the chain with precision, sparks hissing as it struck metal and steel, redirecting the raider without striking outright. The scent of fear and blood layered in the air, acrid and sharp. Flames from the skull flickered, casting long shadows over jagged debris. The rider exhaled slowly, smoke curling upward. Heat rolled across his shoulders, across the bike, across the flats. The wasteland pressed in from all sides, mutants regrouping, raiders recovering, the scent of blood, charred flesh, dust, and ozone thick in the air. He flexed fingers, adjusted boots, tilted torso, chains rattling softly, every micro-movement deliberate. The choice to protect, not destroy entirely, had consequences. The enemy would rise again, testing his limits, probing his restraint. The survivors whispered, trembling, faces pale in the flickering light. The rider inhaled deeply, tasting acrid smoke, burnt metal, dust, and blood. Spars hissed softly, chains coiling lightly, heat radiating in waves. Every inhale mapped the aftermath. Fear, hesitation, aggression, survival. The wasteland would not forgive inaction, nor would it forget his presence. And yet for the first time in the long stretch of fire and blood, the rider felt the weight of choice. The pull of vengeance versus the fragility of protection. Smoke curled from the flaming skull, chains rattling softly, sparks scattering across jagged debris. The plains beyond waited, silent, dangerous, a test of endurance, morality, and control. The canyon yawned ahead, jagged walls towering above fractured earth. The rider's tires crunched over ash, dust, and broken concrete, chains rattling softly as he threaded between twisted debris. Smoke from scorched metal and burning tires hung thick in the narrow space, acrid and suffocating. He inhaled sharply, tasting layers of sulfur from irradiated soil, ozone from sparking chains, and faint copper of blood already shed. Movement flickered across the canyon floor. Raiders regrouped atop jagged ridges, engines whining, patchwork vehicles creaking under rust and heat. Mutants crawled through fractured rubble, ammonia-heavy breaths thick in the hot air. The rider tilted his head, nostrils flaring, reading micro-movements in their postures. The hesitation beneath aggression, the desperation masked by bravado. Sparks hissed as chains brushed metal fragments, illuminating rusted beams and jagged rocks in flickers of orange and gold. He leaned forward, heat rolling from his flaming skull, engine humming low, boots pressing unevenly over jagged rubble. Micro shifts in posture, subtle tilts, precise flexing of fingers controlled every motion. Flames licked higher along the skull, casting jagged shadows over the canyon walls. Smoke curled around him, acrid, thick, carrying the tang of burnt metal, faint blood, and ammonia-laden mutant breath. A mutant pack surged from the left, claws scraping stone and twisted metal. The rider inhaled sharply, tasting ammonia, sweat, and faint metallic tang of blood. Chains coiled, hissing sparks as they struck metal beams and debris, redirecting the creature's mid-lunge. Heat radiated outward, acrid tang of burnt flesh mixing with ozone and sulfur in the tight canyon air. From above, raiders fired down, gunpowder sharp against the smoke and ozone. The acrid scent cut through the layers of burnt metal and dust, clinging to the rider's gloves and boots. He twisted slightly, coiling chains to strike a jagged rock, sending sparks into the air to blind or deflect fire. The metallic tang of scorched metal mingled with gunpowder, sweat, and coppery blood. Micro-movements, tiny heel shifts, flexing fingers, tilting torso, every adjustment precise. Another mutant lunged from behind a jagged boulder. The rider inhaled, nostrils flaring at the ammonia-heavy tang of rot, layered with faint copper of fresh blood and acrid ozone. Chains coiled, sparks hissing as they wrapped around the mutant's limbs mid-strike, redirecting it into rubble without unnecessary kill. The acrid tang of burnt flesh and ozone rose sharply in the air. Flames flickered across jagged rocks, reflecting in shards of twisted metal. A raider vehicle barreled forward, engines screaming, tires throwing dust, sweat, and faint gunpowder into the hot air. The rider leaned low, chains rattling softly, sparks hissing as he struck jagged metal along the canyon wall. Flames from the skull licked higher, heat rolling outward, acrid tang of burned rubber and metal mingling with sulfur and ozone. The raider swerved, skidding across fractured rock, dust and sparks erupting in miniature explosions around tires. Mutants pressed from multiple sides, ammonia-heavy breaths curling into every corner. The rider inhaled sharply, tasting fear, sweat, blood, and the acrid tang of burnt metal. Every micro-movement, slight heel tilt, subtle torso lean, precise flex of fingers kept him balanced and in control. Sparks hissed against jagged rocks and debris, flames reflecting off metal shards, acrid heat rolling outward. A raider with a makeshift flamethrower advanced. oil-heavy smoke sharp in the rider's nostrils. He tilted his head, reading micro-shifts in posture and engine vibration. Chains coiled, sparks hissing as they struck a rusted beam, redirecting the flames into a sand-strewn gap. The acrid bite of burning oil and ozone layered with dust, burnt flesh, and faint copper of blood. The canyon became a cage of layered scents and motion, smoke curling from chains, flames licking skull and walls, mutants snarling, raiders sweating and firing, debris rattling under tires and boots. The rider exhaled slowly, letting heat roll outward, chains rattling softly, micro-adjusting posture, boots scraping jagged rubble. Every inhale mapped the battlefield. Fear, aggression, hesitation, desperation, and the faint metallic trace of blood carried on the wind. For a suspended moment, the canyon held still, tension layered in sense and motion. The rider flexed fingers, tilted torso, adjusted heels, coiling chains like serpents. Sparks hissed, flames flickered, acrid tang of burned metal, blood, dust, and ammonia. Heavy mutant breath, thick in the air. The combined forces pressed against him, yet each micro-movement, each inhalation kept him centered, calculating, in control. He exhaled, smoke curling from the flaming skull, heat rolling outward, chains rattling softly. Sparks hissed against debris. The mutants and raiders faltered, sensing the infernal presence dominating the canyon floor. The rider inhaled deep, tasting acrid smoke, sulfur, scorched metal, and the faint copper of blood, a reminder that his choices had escalated the conflict, and the Wasteland would not forgive or forget. The rider's tires skidded over fractured rock and jagged debris, chains rattling softly as the canyon widened into the ravine. Smoke from smoldering fires curled upward, acrid, sharp, carrying the tang of charred metal and faint copper of blood lingering from the earlier fights. Sulfur from irradiated pools stung his nostrils, mingling with ozone from sparks curling off chains. Each inhale layered him in the battlefield, mapping threat and movement without a glance. Mutants surged from the shadows of collapsed structures, ammonia-heavy breaths thick in the cooling air. Their claws scraped jagged metal and rock, the acrid tang of rot and old injuries trailing behind them. Raiders swerved over fractured asphalt, tires skidding, engines whining. The rider tilted his head, nostrils flaring, reading micro-movements, hesitation beneath aggression, desperation beneath bravado. Sparks hissed as chains struck metal fragments, reflecting in the orange glow of fires and the flickering flames of his skull. He leaned low, tilting torso, subtle shifts in heel and fingers. Every micro-movement kept him balanced, ready to strike or redirect. Heat radiated from his flaming skull, rolling in waves across the canyon floor. Acrid smoke, sulfur, burnt metal, and faint coppery blood thickened in the tight air, clinging to leather, gloves, boots, and the jagged edges of the ravine. A mutant lunged from the left, claws scraping rock and twisted metal. The rider coiled a chain mid-air, sparks hissing as it struck metal fragments to redirect the attack. The acrid tang of burnt flesh cut through ozone and sulfur, layering in his nostrils. He inhaled sharply, tasting fear, rot and blood, calibrating each movement. Subtle heel tilt, slight torso lean, flecks of fingers. From above, raiders fired, gunpowder acrid against the smoke-choked air. The rider twisted the bike, chains coiling and striking metal, sparks hissing, deflecting bullets and debris. Flames licked higher along his skull, heat rolling outward, acrid tang of scorched metal mingling with sweat and gunpowder. Micro-adjustments, tiny shifts in weight, Subtle flexing of fingers, precise tilts of torso kept him balanced amidst chaos. A larger mutant barreled through the ravine, ammonia-heavy breath curling toward him. The rider inhaled sharply, tasting rot, sweat, faint blood, and acrid ozone. Chains coiled, sparks hissed as they struck metal beams, redirecting the creature mid-lunge. Flames from the skull flickered, casting shadows over jagged debris and broken vehicles. Heat rolled outward, acrid and sharp, clinging to boots and gloves. A raider attempted to flank from behind a scorched car. Sweat, oil, and gunpowder struck the rider first, sharp and metallic. He flexed fingers, coiling chains, sparks hissing as metal struck debris, redirecting the raider off course. Acrid tang of burnt metal, coppery blood, and ozone layered the canyon air, thick and suffocating. The rider exhaled slowly, smoke curling from his flaming skull, chains rattling softly. Micro-shifts, heel, torso, fingers, kept him in control as mutants and raiders converged. Acrid smoke, sulfur, burnt metal, and faint copper of blood layered thick in the air, clinging to every surface, marking every inhalation with threat and consequence. He paused for the briefest moment atop a jagged rock, inhaling deep. The acrid tang of burnt flesh and charred metal filled his senses, mingled with ammonia-heavy mutant breath and sweat from raiders below. Sparks hissed softly as chains coiled lightly, heat rolling outward. Every micro-movement became a silent calculation. Which foe to strike, which to redirect, which choice would preserve life, and which would destroy it. From the far edge, another mutant surged, larger, more aggressive. At the same time, raiders advanced with torches and crude firearms, engines whining across fractured terrain. The rider tilted his head, nostrils flaring, tasting fear, sweat, sulfur, burnt metal, and faint blood. Micro-adjustments, tiny heel tilts, torso shifts, flecks of fingers, dictated each chain coil, each dodge, each flame flicker from the skull. Sparks hissed, heat radiated, acrid smoke curled around him. The canyon seemed to contract around him, walls closing with layered threats, scent and motion thick and suffocating. Every inhale carried danger, ammonia, scorched metal, gunpowder, blood, sweat, ozone, sulfur. Every micro-movement, every chain coil, every flex of fingers, every tilt of torso, balanced precision with necessity. Flames flickered higher, casting jagged shadows across the ravine, illuminating the converging enemies. He exhaled slowly, smoke curling from his flaming skull, chains rattling softly. Sparks hissed against jagged debris, acrid layers of burnt metal, blood, sweat, ozone, and sulfur filled the air. The rider had reached the edge, not of the canyon, but of himself, of his patience, of his restraint. Every choice now carried irreversible consequence. Protect the innocents, punish the aggressors, or surrender to vengeance. In the thick haze, with mutants snarling and raiders circling, the rider inhaled deeply, tasting acrid smoke, burnt metal, sulfur, and faint blood. Micro-shifts guided each movement. Heat rolled outward. Sparks hissed. The canyon waited, holding its breath. The wasteland had pushed him here, to the edge, and he had no choice but to meet it fully. The rider's tires tore across the ravine floor, crunching ash and fractured concrete beneath leather boots. Sparks hissed as chains struck jagged metal fragments, curling into the smoke-laden air in streaks of orange and gold. Acrid tangs of burnt metal and ozone clung to gloves and boots. The faint coppery hint of blood carried on the wind, sharp against the layers of sulfur rising from irradiated pools. Each inhale mapped the converging chaos, Mutants closing in from shadows, raiders swarming from ridges, engines whining, chains rattling. Heat rolled outward from his flaming skull, a slow wave across the ravine floor, mingling with acrid smoke. Flames flickered against jagged rocks, reflecting in puddles of irradiated water. The rider tilted slightly, subtle shifts in torso, heel and fingers controlling each movement. Sparks hissed as chains struck debris, every micro-adjustment precise, deliberate, calculated. Mutants surged from the shadows, ammonia-heavy breaths thick and sour. Their claws scraped jagged rock, tearing at rusted metal debris, acrid rot trailing behind them. The rider inhaled sharply, tasting the ammonia, the faint metallic tang of old wounds, the acrid bite of scorched flesh. Chains coiled mid-lunge, sparks hissing, redirecting the creatures without unnecessary kill. Flames licked higher, illuminating twisted forms and broken vehicles. From above, raiders advanced, engines whining, tires skidding, guns raised. Sweat, oil, and gunpowder hit the rider first, sharp and metallic, layered over acrid smoke and sulfur. He twisted the bike, chains coiling, sparks hissing against metal and rock to redirect fire. Flames from his skull flickered across the canyon walls, heat rolling outward, acrid tang of burnt metal mingling with coppery blood and sweat. A large mutant barreled toward the survivors huddled in the debris, ammonia-heavy breath curling through the air. The rider inhaled sharply, tasting faint blood, acrid ozone, scorched metal, and sulfur. Chains coiled, sparks hissing as they struck jagged beams, redirecting the creature mid-lunge. Flames flickered across the ravine, illuminating shadows of mutants and raiders alike. Micro-movements, subtle shifts of heel, torso tilt, flecks of fingers kept him balanced, precise, untouchable. A raider with a crude flamethrower roared from the far edge, oil and smoke burning sharply in the rider's nostrils. He tilted his head, reading micro-shifts in posture and engine vibrations. Chains coiled, sparks hissing as they struck metal debris, redirecting flames into sand-strewn gaps. Acrid smoke, sulfur, burnt metal, ozone, and faintly sweet copper of blood layered thick, clinging to leather and gloves. Mutants pressed from multiple sides. Raiders fired blindly, sweat and gunpowder sharp in every inhalation. The rider exhaled slowly, smoke curling from his skull, heat radiating outward, chains rattling softly. Every micro-movement, tilt of torso, subtle heel shifts, flexing fingers, kept him balanced amidst the converging chaos. Spark hissed against debris, flames flickered, acrid tang of burnt flesh and metal thick in the air. He felt it, the pull of exhaustion, the weight of each decision, the moral cost of his choices. Every mutant redirected, every raider stopped, every chain coil and flame flicker carried consequence. The survivors trembled in shadows, faces pale, sweat streaking dust-streaked skin. The rider inhaled sharply, tasting fear, acrid smoke, coppery blood, burnt metal, ozone, and sulfur. Another mutant lunged, claws raking debris, ammonia-heavy breath curling upward. The rider flexed fingers, coiled chain mid-air, sparks hissing, redirecting it into rubble. Flames licked higher, heat rolling outward, acrid tang of scorched flesh and ozone clinging to the canyon air. Micro-adjustments guided him, heel tilt, torso lean, subtle finger flexing, all deliberate. Raiders attempted to flank from above ridges, tires skidding, engines whining, sweat, oil, and gunpowder sharp against smoke and burned metal. The rider tilted slightly, inhaling coppery blood, acrid ozone, and sulfur-laced air. Chains coiled, sparks hissing, striking metal fragments to redirect movement, deflect bullets, and maintain dominance over the battlefield. The canyon floor became a pressure cooker of layered sense and motion, smoke curling from chains, flames licking skull and walls, mutants snarling, raiders trembling and firing, debris rattling. The rider exhaled slowly, heat rolling outward, chains rattling softly, sparks hissed, flames flickered, acrid tang of burnt metal, sweat, ozone, sulfur, and coppery blood thickening with each inhale. He paused, micro shifts in posture, subtle tilts, heel adjustments, flexed fingers, chains coiled and hissing, flames flickering. The mutants and raiders hesitated, reading the infernal presence dominating the ravine. He inhaled deep, tasting acrid smoke, burnt metal, sulfur, ozone, sweat, and faint copper of blood. A reminder that every choice had escalated the battle and anchored him to the Wasteland's harsh verdict. The rider exhaled slowly, smoke curling from his flaming skull, chains rattling softly. Sparks hissed, heat rolling outward. The combined forces pressed in, yet every micro-movement, every inhale, every chain coil maintained the fragile balance. The Wasteland had pushed him to the edge of exhaustion, and the moral consequences pressed down like the jagged walls surrounding him. The first light of dawn slanted across the ravine, cutting through the tendrils of smoke curling from smoldering fires. Acrid tangs of burnt metal and faint blood lingered in the cooling air. Dust clung to leather and boots, shifting with every subtle movement. The rider's flaming skull flickered low, heat radiating softly, chains rattling against metal fragments, sparks hissing quietly in the early light. Survivors emerged from shadows, cautious, trembling, faces pale, eyes wide with disbelief. Sweat streaked across ash-covered skin, dust caked in streaks along their arms and hair. The rider tilted his head, nostrils flaring, reading the layered sense of relief, fear, and lingering adrenaline. Spark hissed softly as he shifted. Micro-adjustments of heel, subtle torso lean, fingers flexing over chains. Every movement deliberate, silent, controlled. The survivors whispered to one another, voices hoarse, echoing faintly across jagged rocks. The acrid tang of smoke and charred metal clung to their clothing and hair, faint metallic hints of blood lingering in the air. The rider inhaled sharply, tasting dust, scorched metal, faint coppery blood, and the acrid tang of burned oil. Sparks hissed from chains as he coiled them slowly, the sound rhythmic, methodical. One survivor, a young woman with dirt-matted hair, stepped forward hesitantly, eyes scanning the smoldering ruins behind her. Sweat and ash streaked her face, mingling with the acrid smoke rising from scorched debris. The rider shifted slightly, chains rattling softly, micro-tilts of the torso, fingers flexing subtly. He exhaled, smoke curling from the skull, heat radiating outward. The faint metallic tang of blood and scorched flesh clung to the canyon air, acrid and sharp. A small child emerged from behind a twisted vehicle, clutching a scorched blanket, fear and awe mingling in wide eyes. The rider inhaled, the layered sense of sweat, dust, fear, and faint blood mapping every micro-movement. Hesitation, relief, recognition. Sparks hissed softly as chains brushed metal fragments on the ground, the sound a subtle echo across the canyon floor. The survivors began moving cautiously toward safer ground, stepping over debris, boot heels crunching ash and fractured concrete. The acrid smoke, burnt metal, and faint coppery blood layered thick in the cooling dawn air, clinging to boots, gloves, and leather. Each inhale mapped the terrain, the survivors' cautious movement. the lingering presence of danger. From the edge of the ravine, distant howls rose, mutants regrouping, raiders fleeing, engines echoing faintly across fractured asphalt. The rider tilted his head, nostrils flaring at the acrid layered scents: fear, sweat, burnt metal, faint blood, sulfur, and ozone from distant sparks. Sparks hissed softly as chains coiled lightly, flames flickering along the skull. Micro shifts in posture, subtle tilts, flexing fingers, all deliberate, maintaining balance and vigilance. He exhaled slowly, smoke curling from the flaming skull, heat radiating in soft waves. Acrid tang of burnt metal, faint blood, dust, and smoke clung to the canyon walls and canyon floor. Sparse hissed as chains rattled softly against debris. The rider inhaled deep, tasting the layered aftermath: fear, sweat, scorched flesh, burnt metal, and the faint metallic tang of blood. A survivor stumbled, scraping ash and debris from boots. The rider shifted slightly, tilting torso, coiling chains softly, sparks hissing. Heat rolled outward from the skull, flickering over jagged rocks and smoldering debris. Acrid smoke lingered, charred metal hissed faintly in cooling air, faint coppery tang of blood clinging to the canyon floor. Micro movements of heel, torso, and fingers guided him silently, reading the survivor's progress and every potential threat. The survivors finally reached a ridge above the canyon floor, pausing to survey the smoldering ravine. Smoke curled upward in slow, acrid spirals, burnt metal glinting faintly in the soft orange light. Faint coppery tang of blood clung to debris. The rider inhaled sharply, tasting the aftermath, the weight of action, the consequences of choices, the fragile relief of survival. Sparks hissed softly from coiled chains, flames flickering across jagged rocks. For the first time in long hours, the rider allowed a slow exhale, smoke curling lazily from the flaming skull. Heat radiated outward, acrid tang of burnt metal and faint copper of blood lingering in the morning air. Micro-adjustments ceased briefly as he observed the survivors ascending, voices whispering, dust clinging to hair and clothing, the acrid remnants of the battle heavy around them. The wasteland acknowledged him, silent, harsh, unyielding, but recognition lingered in the acrid tang of smoke, burnt metal, and faint blood in the air. Sparks hissed softly from coiled chains. Flames flickered across jagged rocks. The rider exhaled, smoke curling upward, chains rattling softly, heat rolling outward. In this moment, the immediate aftermath of the spiral was clear. The survivors safe, the wasteland scorched, and his presence etched irrevocably into the irradiated plains. The rider climbed the jagged ridge slowly, tires crunching ash and shattered rock under leather boots. Chains rattled softly at his sides, sparks hissing as metal scraped against twisted debris. Smoke from smoldering fires below coiled upward, acrid and thick, carrying the tang of burnt metal and faint coppery blood. Each inhale layered him in the aftermath, mapping the flattened wasteland, scattered debris, and survivors slowly making their way to safety. From below, the survivors paused, gathering among fractured vehicles and jagged rock outcroppings. Their eyes followed the rider, awe and fear mixed with cautious relief. Sweat streaked their dust-covered faces, acrid smoke clinging to clothing and hair. The faint metallic tang of blood hovered in the air, sharp against the heavy dust and charred metal. Sparks hissed softly as chains brushed jagged debris, reflecting the low orange light from fires below. The rider inhaled slowly, tasting the layered aftermath: burnt metal, acrid smoke, faint blood, dust, and faint ozone. Every micro-movement, subtle heel shifts, slight torso tilts, precise flexing of fingers kept him balanced over jagged rock, reading the survivor's progress and the lingering tension in the canyon below. Heat radiated softly from the flaming skull, rolling outward in waves, sparks hissing intermittently. A distant screech broke the silence. The remnants of mutant packs regrouping far below, ammonia-heavy breath curling through the air. The rider tilted his head, nostrils flaring, tasting faint copper of blood, acrid burnt metal, dust, and sulfur from irradiated pools. Chains coiled instinctively, sparks hissing, ready to strike if necessary. Micro-adjustments guided each subtle movement. Heel, torso, fingers, every shift precise. One survivor, a small child clutching a scorched blanket, looked up at him, eyes wide and trembling. Sweat, ash, and dust streaked the skin, clinging in layers. The rider inhaled the layered scent of fear, relief, and faint blood, mapping micro-expressions, posture, and tension. Sparks hissed softly as chains brushed jagged rock, heat rolling outward in quiet waves. Flames flickered across the flaming skull, reflecting in shattered glass and twisted metal below. The survivors began moving steadily toward safer ground along the ridge. Boots crunching dust and ash, chains rattling softly as the rider followed at a deliberate distance. Acrid smoke and burnt metal lingered in the morning air, faint coppery tang of blood marking the battlefield behind them. Every inhale carried the layered scent of consequence, survival, and the moral weight of choices made. From the far flats, distant engines whined and screeched, raiders regrouping, scarred by fire and flames. Mutant cries echoed faintly from beyond jagged debris. The rider tilted his head, nostrils flaring, reading threat, desperation, hesitation. Sparks hissed softly as chains brushed twisted metal, flames flickering along the skull. Heat radiated outward in controlled waves, acrid smoke curling around him, burnt metal scent heavy in every inhale. He paused atop the ridge, micro-adjustments in posture, subtle heel tilts, torso shifts, flexed fingers. The survivors had gained a measure of safety, moving cautiously through jagged outcrops and fractured vehicles. Acrid smoke from fires below, burnt metal, faint copper of blood, and dust clung to every surface, every breath. Sparks hissed softly from coiled chains. Flames flickered across jagged rock and smoldering debris. A distant howl echoed across the flats, mutants warning, raiders retreating, the wasteland acknowledging his presence. The rider inhaled deeply, tasting acrid smoke, burnt metal, dust, and faint blood. Every micro-movement, heel, torso, fingers, chains, kept him balanced, controlled, vigilant. Heat rolled outward, flames flickered, sparks hissed softly. The wasteland had been marked. His choices had reshaped it, and the survivor's brief respite was a testament to the path he had taken. The rider exhaled slowly, smoke curling upward from the flaming skull, chains rattling softly. Acrid tang of burnt metal, faint blood, dust, and lingering ozone hung in the air. He tilted slightly, micro-adjusting posture, fingers flexing, heel shifting. From the ridge, the flats stretched below, scarred and smoldering, the irradiated pools glowing faintly in the morning light. Sparks hissed softly, heat rolling outward. The wasteland bore witness, silent, unyielding, aware of the infernal presence dominating the irradiated plains. The rider mounted his bike slowly, tires crunching ash and fractured rock beneath leather boots. Sparks hissed as chains scraped jagged metal fragments at his sides. Smoke from smoldering fires below drifted in thick, acrid tendrils, carrying burnt metal, dust, and faint coppery blood into the cool morning air. Every inhale layered him in the aftermath, survivors ascending the ridge cautiously, twisted vehicles smoldering, distant mutants and raiders regrouping in hesitant retreat. He flexed his fingers over the chains, subtle micro-movements shifting his weight over the bike. Flames along the skull flickered gently, heat radiating outward, rolling over jagged rocks and smoldering debris. The acrid tang of burnt metal, dust, faint blood, and lingering ozone clung to gloves, boots, and leather jacket. Sparks hissed softly against jagged debris, illuminating fractured concrete and twisted metal in fleeting flashes. The survivors paused at the ridge below, whispering to one another, faces pale, dust and sweat streaked across skin. The acrid smoke from the fires curling below carried faint coppery blood, burnt metal, and ash. The rider inhaled sharply, reading their layered scents, relief, fear, lingering adrenaline. Micro-shifts guided his posture, subtle heel tilts, torso shifts, precise flexing of fingers, chains coiling softly at his sides. A child clutched a scorched blanket, stepping cautiously from behind debris, eyes wide. Sweat and ash streaked across her face, hair matted with dust. The rider inhaled the layered scents, fear, tentative relief, lingering copper of blood, acrid burnt metal. Sparks hissed as chains brushed the bike frame, flickering softly. Flames from the skull reflected against twisted metal and rocks, illuminating the survivors' cautious ascent. The flats below stretched wide, scarred and smoldering, irradiated pools glowing faintly in morning light. Mutants and raiders lingered at the edges, ammonia-heavy breath and gunpowder scent faint in the distance. The rider tilted his head, nostrils flaring, tasting acrid smoke, burnt metal, faint coppery blood, dust, and lingering ozone. Sparks hissed softly as chains coiled lightly, heat radiating in gentle waves. Micro-adjustments, heel, torso, fingers, kept him balanced, ready, controlled. He exhaled slowly, smoke curling from the flaming skull, flames flickering across jagged rocks. Acrid tang of burnt metal, faint blood, dust, and smoke hung in the air. Sparks hissed softly, chains rattling quietly against debris. The survivors had gained safety, yet the wasteland remained scarred, the consequences of fire, flame, and infernal judgment lingering in every corner. A distant howl rose across the flats, mutants regrouping, raiders retreating. The rider inhaled deeply, tasting the layered aftermath, fear, sweat, acrid smoke, burnt metal, faint coppery blood. Every micro-movement, tilt of torso, heel shifts, flexed fingers, subtle coiling of chains, kept him centered. Flames licked higher briefly, heat radiating outward, acrid tang of scorched metal and ozone mingling in the air. The survivors moved toward safer terrain, boot heels crunching ash, dust clinging to clothing. Their whispers carried faintly across the ridge. Sparks hissed softly as chains brushed jagged rock and debris, heat radiating outward, acrid tang of burnt metal, and faint blood marking the path they had survived. The rider tilted slightly, micro-adjusting posture, fingers flexing, heels shifting. He exhaled slowly, smoke curling from the skull, flames flickering in gentle arcs. From the ridge, the rider surveyed the irradiated flats, the smoldering ruins, the twisted vehicles, the lingering smoke, and the faint coppery tang of blood suspended in the air. The wasteland bore witness, the fire, the destruction, the infernal presence. Sparks hissed, chains rattled softly, flames flickered, heat rolled outward in controlled waves. Micro-shifts guided each subtle movement. With a final deliberate exhale, The rider kicked the bike forward, tires skimming ash, dust, and jagged rock. Chains rattled softly, sparks hissing against twisted metal. Flames flickered along the skull, heat radiating outward, acrid tang of burnt metal and faint copper of blood trailing in his wake. The survivors paused, eyes wide, whispers hushed. The wasteland would remember. The rider's silhouette receded along the ridge, smoke curling, chains rattling softly, flames flickering against jagged rocks. Acrid smoke, burnt metal, dust, and faint coppery blood hung in the morning air. Every inhale, every micro-movement, every subtle shift had carried consequence, and the wasteland had accepted the presence of something infernal, unstoppable, and irrevocably changed. He disappeared over the ridge, leaving behind scarred flats, survivors cautious but alive, and a wasteland forever marked by the fire of a flaming skull, the hiss of chains, and the acrid tang of blood, smoke, and scorched metal.